Welcome to the 100th episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I can't believe it's been 2 years since Reid and I started this show. We're so grateful to all of you who've listened, who've shared the show with people, and who've benefited from our episodes. We celebrate today by taking a look back on this 2-year journey, and then we dive into our topic for today, which is Stoicism. We discuss the overlap between Stoic philosophy and other popular philosophies like Buddhism. We talk about how Stoicism has influenced modern psychotherapy. We reveal how Stoic practices have improved our lives personally, and then explore how such practices might enhance the psychedelic therapy experience. Couple of announcements. This one's for all of you therapists, doctors, nurses, coaches, guides, healers, etc. Are your clients asking questions regarding doing their own psychedelic retreats or local experiences? Have your clients just returned from an experience and are asking you for support integrating this into their lives? If you'd like some excellent training on how to answer these questions and support your clients both legally and ethically, Numinous is offering a course on psychedelic harm reduction and integration that just might help. Click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/our-training-selection and use the code PTF10 for 10% off the PHRI course. If you haven't signed up for the MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference yet, it's not too late. Numinous is offering an exclusive 20% discount code for our PTF podcast listeners. Click on the link in our show notes and use the code NWI20 at checkout. Thank you so much to all of you who have been with us from the start. To any of you who are new as of this episode, it means so much to me and Reid that you listen. Please enjoy today's episode on Stoicism. Reid, this episode is our 100th episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast.
What?
I know, can you believe it?
We've done 100 of these.
100 episodes. We started this podcast almost 2 years ago. And I was listening to your interview with Paul Austin on the Psychedelic podcast. Mm-hmm. And you talked a little bit about the origin story of our podcast, which is cool. It was fun to listen to that interview. So go check it out, people, if you haven't heard Reid's conversation with Paul. But I thought it might be fun just to sort of reflect on these 100 episodes. We haven't missed a week. I'm proud of us. I'm proud of our producer, Jamie, for doing all the hard work. But yeah, we started this podcast 2 years ago, almost on a whim. You know, we had both loved podcasts generally, learned a lot over the years from podcasts. And I sort of had this burning desire to pay some wisdom forward. Mm-hmm. I've accumulated a lot from just wonderful teachers and, you know, some teachers whom I've never met and just benefited from their wisdom via books and podcasts and audiobooks and the like. Mm-hmm. I remember when we were talking about what to name the podcast, and we kicked around a bunch of different names. One of them, which I still love, was Inner Space Expeditions. Yeah. Because we were trying to decide how specific do we want to get? Do we want to carve out a niche in psychedelic medicine specifically? Because anybody who's listened to our podcast for a long time has heard a variety of episode topics, many of which aren't necessarily specifically about psychedelics, but we felt like there still wasn't a ton of really good, free to access, easy to access information out there about psychedelic assisted therapy, psychedelic medicine. Hence the name Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. We feel like that, you know, this industry, at least in its modern form, is still on the frontiers. It's still a burgeoning industry, and wanted to just think out loud, I guess, in public on a podcast about this stuff.
Yeah, that was a fun debate, and I still wonder to this day if the psychedelic part of our name is fitting or not, because, you know, first and foremost, we're mental health practitioners who practice psychedelic therapy. And we love to talk about mental health, neuroscience, and how it intersects with psychedelics, but we don't focus most episodes on psychedelic content only.
Right.
It's kind of woven in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in my little canned intro, I say, that not only do we explore the frontiers of psychedelic medicine, but also what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. And that was sort of our nod to, we're not just going to talk about psychedelics specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Living life is quite the psychedelic experience in and of itself, unaltered by fungus or plants or animal alkaloids.
The way I dissolve that dissonance in me is knowing that psychedelic means mind manifesting and doesn't have to mean taking a drug or a plant. And they're great tools for exploring our inner worlds. And like you said, even life is a trip, and many things you could call psychedelic.
Yeah, I like that. It's been fun as we approach this 100th episode for me to just look at our catalog of episodes, even go back and watch some of the first episodes we recorded.
And cringe a little.
It's like, not that those episodes aren't great, but it's been gratifying for me at least to grow, like I said before, in public. It's a vulnerable thing to have these fairly unstructured conversations and reveal more or less about ourselves and what we think and how we feel. And you open yourself up to criticism. And I'm grateful that we haven't received a ton of just mean-spirited criticism.
Where are the haters at?
Yeah. We've received some really good constructive feedback, which I'm super thankful for.
Yeah.
But to read the reviews, to get messages from our listeners, that are overwhelmingly positive has been really, really gratifying for me.
Yeah, it is fun to look back at those moments when we were like, should we really do this? Will people listen? Will our moms listen? Will they like it?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, being liked. You and I have talked privately and even on the show about our evolution as nice guys, as people pleasers. And it still really does matter to me that I don't upset people, but I feel less attached to that part of me more and more as I try to take my seat in the world and serve as best I can, in a way that's really aligned with who I think I am or who I'm trying to become.
You attribute that to trying on being vulnerable, or the topic of today that we'll get into, which is Stoicism?
A little bit of both, I think.
But it is a great practice, like getting vulnerable, pushing outside of your comfort zone, and evolving with others.
Yeah, with others. Yeah, and also, like we've talked about on the show, and we'll talk about it today with our topic, evolution happens at those edges, right? Evolution doesn't tend to happen within the comfortable confines of the comfort zone.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this has been a growth-promoting exercise, and I hope it continues indefinitely.
Me too. And I love what you said about paying it forward, too, because that's, I think, my goal as well, is just to provide free, hopefully useful, good information to people who may be able to get something from it.
Yeah. The information, I think, is super important. Also, just sharing, this is going to sound maybe a little weird, but just sharing our relationship, sharing our humanity. That's one of the things I really loved about long-form podcast conversations, which is why we designed this podcast this way, is that it's also a peek into a person's life. And I'm a connection junkie. I'm an intimacy fan. And so it's, again, really gratifying for me to just share vulnerably in that way.
Yeah, I agree. Well said. And I like looking back at how initially I think you and I both would worry a little more of how it would go, or even afterwards we'll be like, whoa, was that terrible?
Right. Should we even release that episode?
And then we've never not released one. And we've never edited out anything that we said and regretted or anything like that. I mean, there might have been some trimming of gaps or when someone pounds on the door or something like that, even though those are fun to leave in as well.
Yeah, well, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of me. I'm proud of us.
Likewise.
Let's keep going to the extent that we find it useful and that other people find it useful. I'm excited to see maybe what the next 100 episodes brings and how we've evolved and changed in another 2 years.
Yeah, amen. And I've been thinking maybe we should do another Q&A soon. Like put it out there socially to the community, listeners and otherwise, future listeners, and ask for questions and topics.
I love it. I love it. Our email address is available. It keeps changing. What is it? ptfpodcast@numinous.com.
It's good to know. I'll try it.
So feel free to email us questions. So today we're talking about Stoicism. But before we launch into it, I have sort of just a random Hape meditation story. I was meditating with Hape this morning in my living room, just feeling super dialed in, chill, in the present moment. And then my dog hopped onto my lap. I love my dog. He's super cuddly, super soft. And my meditation shifted from, breathing into my heart and, opening up to intuition to just connecting with this animal. With this animal I have, welcomed into my home, made part of my family. And I was just like breathing into the dog and feeling so much love. And dogs are, of course, famous for being very loving animals. But I connected with my dog. I tripped with my dog a bit. I connected with my dog in a way that I haven't before. So if you haven't tried it, folks, not that you need Hape to facilitate, but meditate with your pets.
Hape with your animals. It reminds me of that Ram Dass meditation by East Forest that we've talked about on here before, Sit Around the Fire, where he says, how do you open your heart? You love that which you can love and keep expanding it, including a tree, a cat, a dog, a lover, and that's the gateway into the heart.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for making that connection. So anyway, thanks for indulging my random meditation story with my dog.
Oh, I like stories. And it also kind of reminds me of one thing I've been thinking about on this topic of the roots of psychotherapy as we know it today that stem from Stoicism and the roots that stem from other lineages like Buddhism. And, maybe we can talk about that a little bit, but because Buddhism, you might think of as behaviorism with heart, and Stoicism in therapy might show up as behaviorism with virtue. And we can talk about what the Stoics meant by virtue, but and they're not at odds by any means. I mean, being honest, if I were to look at how I practice therapy, it includes both. Those things that come from Stoicism and things that come from, Buddhism and Hinduism and other Eastern philosophies as well.
There are a lot of overlaps and parallels, right? And when I think about that, I think the problems of human consciousness, the ones that we experience now in 2023 in our modern age, are not that different, maybe exactly the same as the problems of human consciousness that people experienced thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
And people who've thought deeply about this have often come to very similar conclusions about suffering, about virtue, about right mind, right action, about being wise, about the attachment to outcomes leading to suffering. All these things that you would recognize in Buddhism, you might also see in Stoicism or in world religions like Christianity.
It blows my mind that something like Stoicism that is some 2,300 years old is so applicable today. In fact, I think Stoic philosophy is the first written form of self-help that people have been able to identify.
Yeah. I've never heard it described that way, but that makes total sense. At least the first written form we have current records of.
Yeah, I've been thinking this week of what would it be like to live in like 100 AD as a Roman emperor or playwright like Seneca in Stoicism or slave like Epictetus, for example. And, life was so different, but like you said, it's the same common themes that emerge, like our thoughts and emotions. We sometimes take as literal truth. But both Buddhism and Stoicism encourage us to question it. And both acknowledge how we're patterned and conditioned by life, by nature, by interactions with others. And therefore, our beliefs, thoughts, emotions are conditioned and patterned by those experiences. And both approaches, in a similar way, encourage us to separate out to really look for the truth in it all, and cut through the noise and pick this wise-minded path.
It makes me wonder, a lot of people, when they talk about the problems of modern life, they'll compare it to how we might have been, not a couple thousand years ago, but like 100,000 years ago, when we think we existed in these small tribes, where the trappings of modern civilization didn't exist. And they'll say, part of the mental health crisis we're in now is our distance from that old way of living that our nervous systems evolved in, like that particular milieu. So I wonder if we went back even further, if the type of wisdom traditions we're talking about now would have been ultimately unnecessary, because we were closer, we were living in a way that was more closely aligned with our nervous systems, with how we evolved generally.
Yeah. Are we talking about pre or before or after the apes got stoned and blew their minds up by eating mushrooms they found in like prehistoric cow dung?
Right. Yeah. Shortly thereafter, I would think. Yeah. Pre-agriculture, at least. But yeah, let's dive into Stoicism. I do want to talk about, maybe with more specificity, its influence on modern second and third wave psychotherapies, but maybe we should just back up and summarize a little bit about what Stoicism is. You were talking about some of the key points. So it's this school of Hellenistic philosophy around 300 BC, started by Zeno of Citium in Athens.
Or flows from Socrates, Plato, and I don't like saying Aristotle. I heard it once, Aristotle. It sounds more like Chipotle that I like.
I'm going to keep saying Aristotle. That's how I always learned. But yeah, Aristotelian ethics are a little bit different, if I remember right, than Stoic ethics.
That sounds fancy.
Aristotelian, yeah.
Aristotelian?
Now we're yodeling.
Yep.
But I actually asked, I was, taking some notes. I'm by no means a Stoic philosopher or an expert on Stoicism, but I asked ChatGPT to summarize Stoicism for me.
Good idea.
And it did a good job from what I can tell. So maybe we can walk through some of these major tenets. Focusing on what is within your control, rather than what is not within your control. Again, you're going to hear a lot of overlaps with Buddhism here as well.
And if I can just throw in some fun quotes along the way on these. So Albert Ellis, that's his name, right?
Yeah.
Who created CBT and REBT.
Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy.
Yeah.
REBT. Yeah.
And he liked to quote Epictetus. Who was actually a slave in the Roman Empire with a non-functioning leg, but who was, even in those circumstances, never really seen as frustrated, or reactively angry or excessively sad. But so Albert Ellis would quote a lot verbatim, and in this thing he wrote called Discourses, he said the chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals and not under my control, and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own. And that, I think, was one of my favorite summaries of this dichotomy, or this concept of control and surrender, control and choice. And one of my favorite Stoic principles to use practically is that idea that some things are in our control, some things are not. We accept what is, like the Serenity Prayer. It's where it comes from, the Stoic ideas. Accept what isn't in our control, and not get overly flustered by it with excessive suffering, and then apply our wise-minded right effort to that which we can.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of, this is now Latin, not Greek, but amor fati,
Yeah.
which I think Nietzsche was famous for diving into, but this idea of accepting fate, the love of fate.
Love
basically.
your fate.
Yeah.
Because if you accept what you can't change, like the parts of your fate that are just happenings, then you're less frustrated, less unhappy with existence. So it makes sense. It's actually quite beautiful.
Yeah. Another, I think, Epictetus quote that I found that Ellis liked to quote is, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them," which I think relates to another idea in Stoic philosophy of rationality as a guiding principle. And you definitely see that influence in cognitive behavioral therapy.
Even in DBT.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any of these, started as cognitive therapy, adding the behavioral part, but this notion that it is the way we think about things that cause our suffering, and that we can stumble into cognitive distortion or thinking errors.
Yep.
And that to be well, to be happy, it means seeing, developing awareness of the erroneous nature of your thinking, seeing the impact that it has on you emotionally, and then trying to evaluate it from this more equanimous place of rationality.
Yeah, and Albert Ellis put this into practical terms with his ABC model of A being the activation or the activating event, the trigger, if you will. Then B is we interpret it through our beliefs, and C, the consequences of that, especially if our beliefs are not consistent with truth, or reacting excessively in a state of resistance, denial of what actually is.
Yeah, when I think of conditions like treatment-resistant depression, for example, that evaluation of beliefs is often really challenging for people.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times they get really, really entrenched, and it's hard to see from the outside in because they're stuck looking at things from the inside out.
And so the Stoics believed that the things under our control weren't the events that happened, but more of our thoughts, even our choices and our actions, things that are in the present moment, besides the event that just happened.
I guess along those lines, acceptance of the present moment, really, really important in Stoic philosophy. Like expanding the borders of what is acceptable to include all things that happen. And then, like you're describing, from that place of acceptance, not that you want it, but accepting that it is what it is, you then move into action. Now, what do I have control over? How potent can I be in my life and in my environment? So it's not pacifism. You're not just sort of sitting back and like letting life hit you in the face. It's just accepting, acknowledging, and then taking, I think, like you said, right action.
Yeah, and it's almost that stance of bring it on, because we get stronger by it. It's a stance of knowing that like wicked, ignorant, ungrateful people will come along most days. And if we let that spoil our day, that's a waste of a good short life. And just going into a day with that stance is pretty empowering.
Yeah. A lot of people, when they think of Stoicism, they think of the colloquial use of the word stoic. Like, oh, somebody is stoic, they're unemotional, they're unflappable. And I don't know if that's exactly what we're talking about here when we talk about Stoicism. It's not that you're unaffected. It's that you can digest what comes at you. It hits you, it affects you, but you don't let it, be the wind in the sails.
Yeah, you let your emotions come as they may, rise and fall. But in line with that saying we sometimes use, what you resist persists. You don't stay stuck in them longer than needed, or you let them rise and fall, and then you choose a wise path forward.
Right. Yeah, and this also sounds a lot like personal responsibility, personal sovereignty. And some people push back on that a bit. Like, don't blame me for my depression. Don't blame me for my anxiety, especially folks who've been traumatized. Something terrible has happened to me and it's changed me. If I am struggling, you see this a lot when people talk about mental illnesses generally, like you have an illness of the mind. It's not, quote, your fault. And it's not. It's not necessarily your fault. And I don't know that the self-discipline and self-ownership that Stoicism implies means that it is all up to you necessarily, that everything that happens to you is, quote, your fault. But I think, like you said, to use your word, it is empowering to know that wherever you find yourself, you still have power to affect your mind, to affect your mood, to affect what happens in your environment through focused, deliberate action.
Yeah. So we can find the good, a speck of good in the circumstances, even though there is evil in the world, and bad things will happen, and they do, and there are very painful parts of life.
Yeah. So the speck of good, you could say that's looking on the bright side. You try to find the good amongst all the garbage. It's also maybe a change in perspective about the bad things that happen. That bad things can be useful, they can be destructive, they can be both.
Yeah.
We've quoted the phrase, "The obstacle is the path," or "The obstacle is the way," which is a very Stoic notion. Along the same lines of what you resist persists, and it's by leaning into the discomfort that we really find empowerment. But yeah, how incredibly empowering is it to look at some tragedy, feel all the facets of that tragedy, but to see that this tragedy might be useful to me. I could grow as a result of this tragedy.
It's that stance of thank you for the triggers that showed me my work and where my internal mechanisms of vulnerability lie, and give me a chance to work on it so that it has less and less power over me as I approach that like Stoic ideal of moving from where you are in your current self to your ideal self of virtue or moral excellence.
And I think it behooves us to have a lot of self-compassion on this in this process. It is a cultivation. It's not a destination that we arrive at. Like, okay, I am now an enlightened sage. I'm an enlightened Buddha. I no longer have problems. I no longer suffer. At least that's not my experience of trying to be more stoic. It's like I've said before in the podcast, it's a constant rebalancing or a constant retuning of the instrument as it falls out of tune.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that Buddhism shares with Stoicism. Like you quoted that well-known Epictetus saying of, it's not the things but our perception of things. And there was a quote I saw by Thich Nhat Hanh that says, wrong perceptions cause incorrect thinking and unnecessary suffering. And so he encourages people to ask themselves continually, are you sure? Are you sure you're thinking about that truly? And it sounds like a very similar approach to how the Stoics would suggest challenging anything that comes up in that regard. Like, looking for the truth and looking for what you control and what you can't, and focus your effort on the stuff you actually can.
Yeah. I mean, you basically just summed up a lot of what cognitive behavioral therapy is. If any of you ever are familiar with Byron Katie and the work, right? If you go through her process of the work, it's very much a cognitive behavioral process. But she has you ask yourself, are you sure? And then ask yourself again, are you really sure? Like, are you 100% sure? If there's any shred of doubt that this unhelpful belief that you are currently entrenched by is true, then you need to explore that shred of doubt.
Yeah, I love that process. And there are a number of spins on this same idea. And, I found it's a matter of trying them all on and seeing what works best for you, including Stoicism. I mean, try it on in situations or for a period of time and see how it does. Like that's the experiment, in my opinion.
So maybe we can talk more about virtue. Virtue and being, the highest good. So the Stoics believe that the highest good is not necessarily material wealth or an excess of external success, but I've got some notes here. It's rather the cultivation of virtuous character traits such as wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control.
Who is it? Seligman?
Yeah, Martin Seligman.
And there was another psychology researcher, Peterson, who maybe 15 years ago published this list of 24 character traits that make up virtue. And we each, in theory, have access to or somewhere inside of us, all of them, but there are probably 4 or 5 that represent best who you are as an individual, what you enjoy or get into the flow most with, and what you can access the most. And those represent more of your signal strengths or your core strengths, and that makes up kind of an individual virtue. It almost reminds me of like Ben Franklin's virtue practice of listing out ones that he wanted to embody and checking them each day for how he was doing with it until he felt like he was doing okay at it.
Yeah. It makes me think of the process and acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, of focusing on value-based living. Getting in touch with what your core values are, and that when you find yourself off kilter, you do the process that the Stoics would certainly endorse. But the idea is you're trying to return yourself in alignment with your particular core values, which might be different from another person's core values.
Yeah, so virtue, or in Stoicism, it's sometimes called arete. And some people trip up on the word virtue because of how religion has presented it.
Morality.
But so I've heard others call it things like moral excellence, but then you might trip up on the morality word, or maybe just excellence. But in reality, it's like living a life that's best suited for you and in line with your moral compass, while still challenging that your moral compass is clean and well tuned, and you're seeing things clearly, and you have like good ethical foundations for all this.
Right. Yeah. The challenge that I run into with that is, like, if I'm calibrating my moral compass, what am I calibrating it to? Am I calibrating it? Is this a moral relativism that we find ourselves in? Like, oh, my morals might be different than your morals. Perhaps. I think a lot of these wisdom traditions land on certain ethical guidelines, you could say, or moral codes that overlap quite a bit. Treating people with respect, treating yourself with respect.
Do no harm.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But
truth telling.
Being honest. Yeah. I mean, certainly like the golden rule, do to people how you would have them do unto you, that kind of stuff.
But it does get tricky in practice, especially under that stoic acknowledgement, like many philosophies do, that there is and will be evil in the world too. What to do in the face of that.
Right. And it's comforting for me to read the Stoics argue with each other. Like, it's not that there was 100% consensus among the people we attribute Stoic thought to. Some disagreement about sexuality, for example, and whether you should be, in tight, complete sexual control, that, surrendering to your lusts or the carnal desires of the flesh is a lower level of being. And then others that would say, no, it's all in the menu. And that it's just a matter of, like you said, in alignment with your internal principles and doing no harm.
Yeah, it makes me think of something we've talked about on here before, and a system of living or philosophy that I'm quite fond of and familiar with, of yoga, and how, like, in certain paths of yoga, like the 8-limbed path or Ashtanga yoga, it's built on these yamas and niyamas, these ethical foundations and precepts, like ahimsa, do no harm, or like brahmacharya, which can be interpreted as, in its extreme or ancient forms, celibacy in certain like communities or ashrams or whatever, when it was a practice that people were doing. Or it could be interpreted as, practicing love in an ethical way, in whatever that means for you, and keeping everyone in your heart as you decide your own path of excellence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me if you can do that, if you can keep everyone in your heart and have that guiding principle of not doing harm, that generally, even if we're all walking our own path, constructed by our own moral code, that we're going to be doing similar things. We're going to be making similar decisions when it comes to how we treat ourselves and how we treat others.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fun question to think about, that moral relativism.
Yeah. So another thing that Stoics talk about is striving to be free of what they call the passions, apatheia, where we get the word apathetic from. This isn't to say that they wanted you to, again, to be apathetic, actually, free of emotion, but it was to be cautious about being taken by emotions that don't align yourself, again, with those values we were talking about.
The heat of the moment, whether it's rage or passion, taking you away from and acting reactively in a way that's not consistent with your values or doesn't keep people in your heart. Apply the golden rule, however you're looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah. This wise person who embodies apatheia, like you describe, is somebody who is level-headed, but they also experience good feelings, and but they experience them in this,
equanimous way.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you said, Stoicism got unfortunately and inappropriately associated with not feeling emotions that our culture went through its own kind of dark night with, especially, 50, 100 years ago, where it was just culturally not, understandably in times of war, not useful or safe to display emotions, and that spread through culture and had some really unfortunate consequences. But there is that middle path of feeling your feelings and acting through wisdom.
Right. And to feel your feelings means to feel the ones that even the Stoics would say we don't want to indulge. Like we've talked about so many times on this podcast, we do need to feel those feelings. So if they are rage, jealousy, envy, greed, these things that show up in our nervous system. I tell my clients, there's, if I talked about it on the show before, but what I call the 3 A's of emotion processing. Like first, you need to have awareness of what's going on, this sort of open container of awareness, and then acceptance. This is what I was talking about before, the self-compassionate, what the Stoics would refer to, as acceptance of the present moment. And then once you've been able to do that, you can then move to action. But you want to do it in that order, because if you allow the emotion to trigger action immediately, it might lead you down the path that you don't want to go.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard of or seen the show Shrinking, by the way?
Mm-mm.
Our podcast producer, Jamie, actually tipped me off to it, but Hannah and I watched the first episode last night, and it has it's this CBT practicing psychotherapist, psychologist or psychiatrist going through his own struggles, but is taking a kind of unconventional approach to a client who was like a combat veteran and comes in with rage. I'm spoiling some things, but it's
Spoiler
okay.
alert.
And decides to take him to an MMA gym, put him in the cage to fight in a way that's controlled and welcomed, because he kept beating people up who would look at him funny at a bar. And then after that, the next time he gets shoved by someone and feels that rage boil, he didn't destroy their face.
Right.
It was kind of cool.
Yeah.
But there's other things that further spoil and complicate it that I won't get into. Yeah.
Don't ruin it for me. Yeah, it's a good example of like learning to surf the waves of your emotion, so that it doesn't, again, lead you to behavior that you wouldn't be proud of.
And that might get you into trouble. Maladaptive behaviors.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, so we talked about virtue. We talked about logic. There's this concept of eudaemonia that shows up in Stoicism that I find intriguing. Wondering what your take is on it.
Well, remind me what it is. I remember the term, but
so to be good with your inner daimon, which daimon means divine spark. you might at first glance think it means inner demon or something, but that would be kind of fun. But it's like to live in harmony with your ideal self, to know that there's a divine spark in you that you need to water and create the right conditions of so it can flourish into your self-actualized, full, higher self. And so to be good with your inner spirit and live in harmony with your higher self as the path. Yeah.
This sounds really consistent with, other forms of therapy, like client-centered therapy, pioneered by Carl Rogers, this Rogerian approach of cultivating the right therapeutic relationship so that a person's daimon, their inner healing intelligence, perhaps, takes the lead, and that will lead them hopefully towards self-actualization.
Yeah, and when the Stoics talk about living in harmony with nature, like that's one thing that I initially or used to get a little tripped up on until I realized that, some things might get lost in translation, and living in harmony with nature is amazing any way you slice and dice it, right?
Right.
But the way I think they mean is that nature wants us to become our highest self. And that's why the inner daimon, or the divine spark, has been planted within us. And so it's our nature to complete what's been started, and then let that divine seed bring our full potential to life.
Interesting. Yeah, not to be too esoteric, but like we are nature, are we not? We're made of the same molecules as everything else, came from the same furnace of stars or whatever. So it would make sense that whatever divine spark exists within us would flourish if we were not only in harmony with our nature, but with the nature surrounding us.
Just like the potential of the oak lies there vibrating within the atomic structure of the acorn, just like this divine spark is in us, ready to kind of blossom into our full potential.
Yeah. What does your divine spark want to blossom into, do you think, Reid? I'm curious.
And that's the question of harmonizing oneself with that. Like the whole path of understanding oneself, why the Stoics focus so much on it, and why I like that idea that of all these possible virtues, take a bite-sized chunk of it that feels right for you, and not trying to be all things to everyone at once. And so I'm deflecting the question, but it's one that essentially you need to live, and takes a lifetime to answer.
That's what I was going to say, that I think it takes a lifetime. I don't know that I will ever truly know myself. Because every year I meet new versions of myself. I meet new parts of myself. I peel away layers of conditioning I didn't realize were there. Like I had no awareness around them. And I find myself being very different in the world, which is, to me, it's exciting. It used to feel like a burden. Like I was sick. I needed to fix myself. I needed to repair myself. But I don't feel like that anymore. It's more of a peeling away layers to unfold what might be there. And there's potential, and it's exciting.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And it's really a good thing to remember as you go through life, that if you haven't been in a very close, intimate partnership, you haven't pushed the buttons that will come from that yet, and done the work or peeled away the layers of yourself in that way. Just like if you haven't lost your job or suffered a big loss or big blow, you haven't had those buttons pushed in that way to know who you are and what work lies deep inside that comes out of that stage of life.
Right. So the work, I came across a quote by a philosopher, Pierre Hadot.
That was, I think, the psychiatrist in the early 1900s who took Stoicism and brought it into therapy before Albert Ellis.
Okay.
Yeah. Swiss. Yeah.
There you go. He talked about that philosophy for a Stoic is not just a set of beliefs or ethical claims. It is a way of life involving constant practice or training, akathesis. an active process of constant practice and self-reminder. So it makes me think, what are some Stoic practices? What are some things that maybe you do or you encourage your clients to do, or we could just invent right now on the spot, that would be consistent with these Stoic philosophies that could help move us to, the things we've been talking about?
Yeah. So one that comes to mind is learning to differentiate between what is true and what is not, and accepting only the truth. It's kind of gets into that control and choice. And a practical example might be anxiety, right? Like when you're feeling anxious, your body may have a response like your hands are shaking, and you can't really control that. That's going to pass eventually. And but if you spend time panicking about the fact that your hands are shaking, then you're not going to be able to work on the other stuff, which may be a negative thought loop you're stuck in based on a false belief that is creating a storm of negative emotion in and of itself. You know what I mean? So practically speaking, when stressed, ask oneself, what is really going on here? What can I control? What needs acceptance? And let that stuff go. And what needs some gentle effort, and apply it there.
Yeah, anxiety is a great example, because anxiety is often about a feared circumstance yet to be.
Yeah.
Often, if we are in the present moment and we're worried about something, we're projecting into the future and allowing this future state, this potential state, to affect us in the moment. So asking yourself things like, what is dangerous right now? Is there something that's threatening me right now? What are the circumstances of the immediate moment? And most of the time, when we're stuck in these anxious thought loops, the truth of that moment is going to be, I'm actually fine. I don't feel fine.
Yeah.
But I have this central nervous system alarm response it's a false alarm, typically.
Yeah. And I want to give a lot of compassion and understanding to conditions where the amygdala alarm bells are stuck in high alert, like PTSD, for example, when, a certain sound might trigger the same response as, sounds did in wartime when it was very unsafe. And that can take a long time, but it is the same principle in the end of figuring out a way to take a step back, from those thoughts, feelings, responses. And it might require lots of help and lots of intervention, and maybe even some psychedelic therapy with MDMA or ketamine or whatever it may be, but examine them and, correct the misperceptions and replace them with a wise response that's consistent with how we want to show up.
Right. Yeah. And this is where I think Stoicism maybe falls a little short. It is a fairly cognitive practice.
Yeah.
And it can be difficult, if not impossible sometimes, to, quote, think your way out of these problems. And this is where I think a lot of the work done in somatic therapy and things like that have a lot to offer in terms of retraining the nervous system. Because sometimes we have these anxious pathways in our nervous system that were there before we even were like very conscious, right? When we were harmed as a young child, or we grew up in an environment that was very, very threatening. We just might have a set of software that isn't very responsive to thinking.
Yeah, and it may even come from genetics too. Like, I don't take a strictly behaviorist approach to all this. Like, yes, that probably most of our conditioning and patterning happens in life, but we're also born with a certain deck of cards genetically, and that may include a serious predisposition to obsessions and compulsions or anxiety, for example.
Yeah. I may have said this on here before, but that was never more true to me than when my second child was born. My first child, came out of the womb just quiet, looking around, super chill, basically, and he's 15 now, and he's basically the same dude. My second child, not so quiet, lots of crying, very reactive to his environment, very sensitive, lots of gut issues, and he's an awesome young man now. And but you can tell he's introverted, He's a little more sensitive to his environment, but also a lot. He sees things. He's very, very acute. He notices things, and some of that just came from the genetic deck of cards he was dealt. It seems.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, an important one.
Other Stoic practices that we can drum up.
Well, you kind of mentioned this one, but trying to harmonize needs and desires with what you can control.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we do fall into this trap of, looking at the neighbors or the social media profiles of people's filtered lives, or feeling like the grass is greener somewhere else besides this present moment. And that's another cause of suffering that the Stoics shine light on.
Yeah, in fact, they would have these meditations where they would deliberately think about what it would be like to be in ruin. And then I think some of them, I've heard Ryan Holiday tell the story, I don't remember which philosopher it was, but they, would actually go and renounce all their belongings for a time and live as a homeless person, live as somebody who is destitute, to confront this state that they were so afraid of. And it's a great, not that I'm encouraging that particular practice, but the meditation itself is pretty useful. Mm-hmm. And it helps reorient you to gratitude, helps see the things you're taking for granted, that maybe they ought not to be taken for granted. And I will say about gratitude, and there's plenty of positive psych research to support this, it is one of the most potent solvents to suffering that I can think of.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the Stoics say instead to be grateful for good people and the good things in life that do exist, and beware of putting importance on riches and recognition, mm-hmm. because that's a castle built on sand that will collapse at any moment. Yeah.
It's so, maybe it's ironic. It just seems interesting to me that is ancient wisdom. Yeah. Pretty much anybody on the street would say as much if you quizzed them on it. Yet it seems to be such a temptation for us. Maybe it's an artifact of our culture, like you were saying, with Instagram and all these sources of comparison. But as the saying goes, comparison is the thief of joy, I think, for that reason.
Yeah, and somewhere along the way, these sneaky app developers notice that if they put a device in your pocket with some positive recognition in the form of a like or a comment, that you'd look at it often, you'd see it, you get a spike of dopamine over and over and over again, and then you're habitually wired to keep opening that thing.
Yeah. Is it BJ Fogg? Is it his lab? I think that just talked about this, like how to influence the human psyche in this way. Kind of terrifying that people who work at Meta and Twitter and whatever probably know more about how to manipulate the human mind than most psychologists do.
Yeah, so that's, I think, another practical thing from Stoicism that I like to remember is we are each part of humanity, and part of this interconnected whole, and we need to work towards the common good there. And if you're going to build something, do it in accord with that moral excellence. Yeah, rather than something for riches and recognition, which, is a trap faced by everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've grappled with it myself. Not the recognition part. I don't really care that much. I mean, I certainly don't want to be famous. That sounds like a complete misery, like a state of misery.
You ask for podcast subscribers sometimes, though.
Well, that's the thing. So I've grappled with it. Like, I'll be super vulnerable and honest here. I do want to have influence. Like, I want to be potent in the world. I want to help people climb their way out of suffering and live a life that is aligned with their values, like live their best lives. I do want to have an impact.
That sounds pretty good.
I do want to have influence, and I need a certain degree of recognition of to be able to impact as many people as I can, right? And it is gratifying for me when people come up and say, I enjoy your podcast, or for a client to say, our therapy together or coaching together has been really helpful. But fame feels like something different. And the riches part, I mean, if anybody wants to give me money, I'll take it. I certainly love the freedom, the autonomy, the access to cool stuff and cool experiences that money brings. But it's so obvious that it's a losing game if acquiring wealth in that way is the end instead of a means to an end.
Yeah. Yeah, it comes back to this idea of virtue or moral excellence, or, finding those things like wisdom and altruism and compassion and good relationships, and focusing there instead of on these other things that wouldn't make that list. Like, I think it was even a Socrates thing where he was debating with some people and saying, and I think it was Epictetus who documented this. Plato was a scribe for it, but it ended up in some Epictetus writings of like what makes a good, someone with good fortune. And then these people he was debating said, "Oh, you're born with good looks. You're born into noble fortune," or just listing off all these things, and he kept going with the Socratic questioning and peeling away the layers of it to expose the fact that those are not actually what is good fortune, and the good fortune is what's inside, and of being a good human, and having that ability to balance and control your thoughts and your priorities, and how you live your life.
Yeah, and I think when we look at survey statistics on well-being or happiness, they track with finances to a point, and then it's pretty apparent that at least in terms of solving for a life of well-being and happiness, you just need enough to not be destitute, enough to pay your bills, enough to stay safe, to feel safe. And then on top of that, I mean, it can almost be a problem for a lot of people.
Yeah. And the Stoics are often the ones who get credit for these sayings that life is short. And, for a while that rubbed me the wrong way in a sense, but I think I get it now that life is precious, and life is unpredictable, painful sometimes, and wasting it doing useless things, whether it's worrying about the wrong things or chasing the wrong things, only adds to the pain.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's memento mori, right? This another Latin phrase. In fact, I have a piece of jewelry that has amor fati on one side and memento mori on the other. Huh. Remember that you are going to die, that life is precious, and let's not waste it doing these other things. Let's spend it the way that would be rewarding.
Yeah, it's like Ariana Huffington says about her wake-up call when she was running the Huffington Post, this really successful, widely accessed publication, but she was working so hard that one night at the office she just passed out in exhaustion and smacked her face on her desk and had a bloody nose, and was like, wait a second, at my eulogy, what do I want people to say? Like, she put in all those hours at work. Thumbs up. No. I think that practice is a good way to recalibrate with what we really value.
Yeah. I've been playing around with this in my own life, in terms of just taking better care of myself, like listening to my nervous system, listening to my soul when it needs something that I'm, for whatever reason, refusing to give it. The other day I was really tired. It was the afternoon, still had some work to do, and I was okay. I could pound an energy drink, and I could just push my way through this and get this thing done. Or I could maybe do the thing that my body needs and lie down for 20 minutes, or just take a walk or something like that. I might actually get more mileage out of that. So I did, and it was great. I actually felt better. I felt more clear-headed than if I had, shotgunned a monster or something like that.
You just shamed me, didn't you? I'm holding a Celsius.
This was actually an intervention.
Because
caffeine intervention.
I thought about taking a nap instead of podcasting with you, and I just couldn't do it.
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad that caffeine exists for that reason then.
The 100th episode. Yeah, it's like Michael Pollan wrote about caffeine in his latest book. Your Mind on Plants? Is that what it's called?
I don't remember.
Yeah. A whole section on caffeine and how it spawned civilization as we know it, because all of a sudden you could stay up all night and work shifts and have hospitals and everything else.
Right.
And podcasts.
And podcasts. Thank you, caffeine. Yeah. I'm not a purist. I still drink caffeine. Don't get me wrong.
I totally agree, and I think it's a powerful, practical application of this is in moments throughout the day, whether it's in response to not feeling your best or a stress or just randomly. Sometimes I'll have people set alerts on their phone to prompt this, is asking yourself the question, what does my nervous system need in this moment? Or what is the most loving thing I can do for myself right now?
Right.
And really listen for an answer.
Yeah, really listen. Because the first one that pops up might not be the most loving thing that you could do for yourself.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the same for you, but I've heard it from many people is sometimes when I go to sit still or take a break, I notice the pull to just do stuff, right? And it's habitual. It's because I've been doing stuff, not just all day, but for many days on end, and ignoring the signals, like whether it's a wave of tiredness saying, take a pause, or some other manifestation of that from inside ourselves.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned conditioning earlier. Like we grew up in a pretty hard charging society here in America. And this idea of rest sometimes gets conflated with laziness, and which is not a virtue, right? You shouldn't be lazy. Sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins, right? But then you look at other cultures that have 2-hour siestas in the middle of the day, and it's just part of the culture. There's tea time, or they're not working straight with a 15-minute bathroom break for 12 hours.
I like to call it a power nap.
Yeah.
It's a good term. But I have been playing with that. The other day, I don't know, within the last few weeks, when I did lay down after a day of work and put my feet up and did nothing for a moment, I was like, why have I not done this earlier today? Even if it's in the sofa right there that's in my office. And why don't I do that more often? Just like pause, and whether it's laying down or sitting down. And so it was a good reminder to me to insert those breaks for real more often in a day-to-day life.
Yeah, it's a good practice. Yeah, I relate to the restlessness though. Like if I'm still for a while, my mind will start going like, what should you be doing right now? It often interferes with my meditation practice. Yeah.
So to throw in a psychedelic thing, a while back when I had a series of high dose psychedelic journeys, in a far off place where it was doable and appropriate and all that, right? 5 dried grams in a dark environment. The first thing of psilocybin mushrooms, the first thing that came up for me was an intense, chaotic, almost screaming like noise in my mind. It was the weirdest thing. But then as I just let it be there, I could have panicked and said, this is weird, I'm out.
Stop,
but
yeah.
how could I get out of that, right?
Good luck.
That's not something you can control. But so after deciding to surrender to it, it was fascinating to see that it just eventually quieted. It's like it had to come out. It had to get released somehow, this chaotic noise, maybe just from the modern hustle and bustle of life that was swallowed and not released in ways until that moment. And then on the other end of that was like a direct channel to the insights I needed. Yeah, it was pretty cool.
It is cool.
And that happened a couple times.
And it's a good example of applying arguably stoic principles to the navigation of a psychedelic journey, right? If you had resisted and tried to control and like, I don't want to hear this noise, screw this noise. But instead it sounds like you did what we often talk about on the show. You surrendered, you got curious, you accepted, you opened, and you found bliss and knowledge on the other side of that struggle.
Yeah. And then I had to resist the urge to get up and immediately act on these insights because they were so good. And I had to trust that I would actually remember them. And remember what we coach people on is like, don't pick up your phone in the middle of an ayahuasca ceremony and and make a big life decision right
Right,
then and there,
right.
but like receive these insights and really integrate them in a wise way.
Yeah. Maybe we could keep talking about psychedelics then. Other concepts from Stoicism that might be helpful for people as they prepare for psychedelic therapy or a healing journey, as they navigate such a journey or try to integrate one.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, a few key Stoic ideas that I think are relevant. Self-knowledge, self-knowledge especially is freedom, is so liberating. And mind manifesting practices, psychedelic practices, medicine or not, are a very helpful tool for that, right?
Yeah.
So that's one. Another kind of lesson learned or Stoic application for me is that, trusting the unfolding, like taking the stance that what comes up is meant to, whether desired, expected, or not, and that what happens, what comes up is meant to come up. And you can even take a stance that this is all happening in accordance with how it should, even if it's uncomfortable.
I've got an Epictetus quote that legitimizes what you just
Cool.
said. So he says, "Difficulty shows what men are. Therefore, when a difficulty falls upon you, remember that God, like a trainer of wrestlers, has matched you with a rough young man. Why? So that you may become an Olympic conqueror. But it is not accomplished without sweat." But the trust that like what has shown up is for your good. That if you get in there and wrestle, or maybe wrestling means surrender, that then you'll benefit.
Yeah, it reminds me of the studies we've talked about here before. They were initially done with psilocybin, showing that it's not only the mystical experience that predicts good outcomes after a psychedelic therapy experience. It's like mystical experience paired with emotional breakthrough or facing something difficult, some challenging experience, making it to the other side. And that's where the gains come from in your personal evolution.
Yeah. I like to call it the sacred ordeal. That when we deliberately enter into this psychedelic space, we are inviting challenge. We are inviting strife. We're inviting ordeal. Sometimes it's just bliss, and those are cool experiences too. But yeah, it's a sacred ordeal because from the ordeal, from the willingness to wrestle with this rough young man that God has presented you with, then then you can experience a breakthrough.
Wrestle with that rough young man version of yourself, huh?
Yeah,
your inner demons. And that are there for a reason, right? It reminds me of another thing that's tied to that 5 dried grams in silent darkness experience I mentioned, is that like inner peace or serenity and stability are results. They're an inside job. It's like they're results of these kind of practices. Our choices are more clear perception and not necessarily the environment itself.
Clear perception. Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's not the things. It's our response to and interpretation of the things. And there is, as psychedelics can have helped me see, is there is a deep reservoir of stillness inside ourselves somewhere, even on the other side of that screaming chaos that we might be conditioned or patterned with or need to release for a time.
Yeah, I like that. Another aspect of clear perspective that I think is common in a psychedelic experience, maybe a result of the ego being dissolved, is you just start to see things from this unified consciousness place, from this expansive consciousness place, and then the little things really do seem little and insignificant. Another Stoic quote here, this one by Marcus Aurelius: "Watch and see the courses of the stars as if you were running alongside them, and continually dwell in your mind upon the changes of the elements into one another. When you are reasoning about mankind, look upon earthly things below as if from some vantage point above them.
Yeah, I love
remember
that.
I was really stressed once when I was younger, and my brother said, "Hey man, have you ever seen this new thing called Google Earth?" This is dating me a little bit, but you can go to a point in the world, and then you just keep zooming out and zooming out and zooming out, and then think of like zooming out beyond our solar system or zooming out beyond the galaxy, and all of a sudden this little tiny blue dot that we're on, and the problems that you're experiencing thereon, just pale in comparison. They seem insignificant.
I loved playing with Google Earth and still do, in fact. So,
It's a cool tool.
But okay, I'll meet your Marcus Aurelius quote with another one, because I think it really sums up what many people experience on psychedelics at those mystical levels. Is he said or wrote, meditate often on the interconnectedness and mutual interdependence of all things in the universe. For in a sense, all things are mutually woven together and therefore have an affinity for each other. For one thing follows after another according to their tension of movement, their sympathetic stirrings, and the unity of all substance.
Oh, wow.
Pretty deep, huh?
Boom. Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like he was on some potent psychedelic elixir at the time.
Right.
For a wise soul.
Got some of that Kaikion back there in the Lucinian Mysteries, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, Reid, anything else about Stoicism? I've been thinking about how I apply it to my life. I think we've covered most of it, though.
Yeah. There's a trippy quote by Seneca that I kind of like because it takes a second to flip it into perspective. But Seneca wrote, to bear trials with a calm mind robs misfortune of its strength and burden. So like a boxer who gets punched in the face doesn't leave the ring because that's what they came for. Like that's their dharma, that's their discipline. And the same is true for stoic philosophers. Just because life slaps you in the face, spits on you, or knocks you down doesn't mean you should give up and leave, right? It's actually what you came here for. And such is life, like a boxing ring, and you got in it, you signed up for it in a way. I know, and it's that stance or attitude that makes approaching challenges a little more meaningful, palatable.
And it seems like a recipe for resilience. It seems like the Stoic path is one of resilience. And as you stated, that taking that stance, that attitude toward the challenges in your life is part and parcel of that resiliency.
Yeah, yeah.
One quick point before we wrap up that my cursory study of Stoicism has helped me with is this notion of meaning making.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, along the lines of it's not what happens, it's what happens next. It's your judgments about a thing that determine how you feel about it. That, you know, it could be argued that there is no thing that has inherent meaning except that what a human mind ascribes to it. That perhaps human minds are the universe striving to experience itself, and as I heard it said once, as stewards of consciousness, we have a responsibility to give the universe a good ride. So
I like that.
Here's to giving the universe a good ride. Thanks for 100 episodes, Reid, and here's to many more.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinous at numinous.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.